The glass hit the floor before anyone moved. I heard it, that sharp, bright crack, and then the whole room went quiet in a way that rooms almost never do. Not gradually, all at once. He was standing in the doorway, flannel shirt, khakis. 71 years old and still the most dangerous-looking man I'd ever seen in a room full of civilians. He looked straight at me past the tray in my hands, past the apron Diane had handed me 40 minutes earlier, and he said it quietly, the way you say something that doesn't need volume to land. "Ghost." One word. The woman next to me dropped her napkin. My stepmother turned from her guests, and for the first time in 30 years, I watched the color leave her face. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired. The good kind of tired. The kind that means something heavy is finally almost over. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your country and your local time in the comments right now. It always means something to me to know who's out there. Now let me take you back to where this really started. A few hours earlier, I almost didn't go. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a rest stop off I-95 40 minutes outside of Alexandria, with the engine running and both hands on the wheel. The invitation had been on my kitchen counter for 3 weeks. A cream-colored card, Robert Alexander's handwriting. My father's handwriting neat, and a little shaky now in a way it hadn't been 5 years ago. "We'd love to have you, Cass. It would mean the world." I had read that line probably 20 times. It would mean the world. I wondered if he knew how much weight those words carried, how much they asked of me. Coming back to that house meant walking back into something I had spent 18 years and several thousand nautical miles learning to breathe without. I am 42 years old. I know that is not ancient. But there are mornings I wake up and my body feels like it has lived 3 or 4 lives inside this one, and on those mornings 42 feels like plenty. I joined the United States Navy at 18. Not because I had a plan, not because I had some cinematic moment of patriotic clarity. I joined because I needed a door, and the Navy was the one standing open. My mother had been gone 4 years by then. My father had remarried 2 years after that, a woman named Diane, who smiled at me the way you smile at a stain on a carpet. You are deciding whether to clean or cover. I was 14 when she moved in. I was 18 when I left. In between, I learned to be invisible. Not emotionally invisible, the kind people romanticize. I mean practically invisible. How to take up less space. How to answer questions with the smallest number of words that still counted as an answer. How to be in a room full of people who had decided you were less than them and give them absolutely nothing to confirm it. That skill, that particular exhausting skill, turns out to be extraordinarily useful in military intelligence and legal work. So I suppose I owe Diane something in a grim accounting kind of way. I went into the Navy as an enlisted sailor, made it through officer candidate school at 23, law degree at 27, night school and weekends and more coffee than any human body should sustain. JAG Corps at 29. I spent the next 13 years doing work I can't describe in full, even now. Some of it courtroom, some of it field, some of it in rooms with no windows and documents that would never be declassified in my lifetime. I was good at it. I was very good at it. Then 4 years ago, I wasn't allowed to be good at it anymore. But I'll get to that. I left the Navy as a lieutenant commander. I live now in a small house in Fredericksburg, Virginia. I have a dog named Atlas, a big, dumb-loving German shepherd who doesn't care what my rank is or was, which I appreciate more than I can explain. I do contract legal work, enough to pay the bills, enough to stay sharp, not enough to make anyone nervous. I had not been back to my father's house in 6 years. The invitation arrived because my father had a mild heart attack in February. Nothing catastrophic, a warning the doctors said. A reminder that the body is not a permanent arrangement. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital, came home, changed his diet, started walking every morning. By April, he was cleared. By May, Diane had organized a dinner party to celebrate his recovery. 40 guests catered string lights in the backyard, the kind of event Diane had always used to remind people of what she had built and who she was. My father called me himself. That was unusual. Diane usually handled the correspondence. The fact that he picked up the phone and dialed my number himself, that meant something. I heard his voice, and I heard the shake in it that wasn't quite emotion, and wasn't quite age, but was somewhere in between, and I said yes before I had decided to. So there I was. Rest stop off I-95. Engine running. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. I had worn a navy blue dress, simple fitted, nothing remarkable. My hair was pulled back. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I just wanted to see my father. Get through the evening without incident, drive home, let Atlas out, make tea. That was the entire plan. I thought about calling ahead, telling my father I was close. Instead, I sat there another 4 minutes, I remember counting them, and then I put the car in drive. Older Americans understand this particular kind of dread. The kind that isn't fear exactly, more like the feeling of pressing on a bruise to check if it still hurts. You already know the answer. You press anyway because leaving it alone has its own cost. I grew up in that house on Sycamore Hill Road. I learned to read in the window seat off the second-floor landing. I broke my wrist falling out of the oak tree in the backyard when I was 9. I made my father a birthday cake from a box mix when I was 11 and burned the edges, and he ate 2 pieces and said it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. And then my mother died, and Diane arrived, and the house became a place where I was tolerated rather than loved. 18 years in the Navy will not fix that. It just gives you enough distance to stop bleeding from it every day. I pulled onto Sycamore Hill Road at 6:47 in the evening. The sun was low and golden, and the old oaks along the street were in full summer leaf, and the house looked exactly the way it always had. White columns, black shutters, string lights already glowing in the backyard, cars lining both sides of the driveway. Beautiful from the outside. It was always beautiful from the outside. I sat in the car for 1 more minute. Atlas wasn't there. There was no tea waiting. There was just the house and my father inside it, and whatever the next 3 hours were going to be. I got out. I smoothed my dress. I walked up the front path. And the door opened before I could knock. Diane opened the door. Of course she did. She was wearing a cream linen pantsuit, and her hair was done the way it always was for company, smooth swept back every strand in agreement with every other strand. She looked expensive. She always looked expensive. It was the thing she was best at. She looked at me for exactly 1 second before her face arranged itself into something that resembled warmth. Cass. She said my name the way you say the name of a piece of furniture you have moved to a new room and are not entirely sure fits. You made it. I made it, I said. She stepped aside to let me in, and I crossed the threshold of my father's house for the first time in 6 years. And the smell hit me before anything else did, cedar and lemon polish, and something baking the specific combination that had meant home when I was 7 and had meant something more complicated ever since. The house was full, 40 guests as advertised. I recognized maybe a third of them neighbors, my father's colleagues from his years in commercial real estate, a few faces from the church he and Diane attended. The other 2/3 were Diane's people. Her book club, her garden committee, the women she lunched with whose names I had never been expected to learn. My father was across the room. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not frail, he was still broad through the shoulders, still had the handshake I had watched him give 100 men over the years. But something had settled into him, some new awareness of his own limits, and it showed in the way he stood. A little more careful, a little more deliberate. He saw me, and his whole face changed. He crossed the room faster than I expected for a man 4 months out of a cardiac event. He took both my hands in his and held them and looked at me, and I could see him doing the math, 6 years of it in real time behind his eyes. "Cass," he said. Just that. Just my name. But he said it the way he used to say it when I was small, and I had to look somewhere slightly past his shoulder for a moment to keep my expression where I needed it. "Hi, Dad," I said. We stood there for a moment that was too short, and I already knew I would think about it for a long time afterward. Then Diane appeared at his elbow. "Robert, the Hendersons just arrived. You should go say hello." She touched his arm light and practiced the way you redirect a child without them noticing. He squeezed my hands once more, told me to get something to eat, and was gently steered away before either of us had said anything more. I watched him go. Then I turned to find a drink and nearly walked into a young woman in a black apron carrying a tray of bruschetta. She was from the catering company, I could tell by the small logo on her shirt. She smiled apologetically and moved past me. I found the drink table and poured myself a glass of sparkling water. "Excuse me." A woman to my left, early 60s, pearls the confident tone of someone accustomed to being helped. She was looking at me. "Could you bring more of those little crab things from the kitchen? The round ones?" I looked at her. She was looking back at me with the patient, pleasant expression of someone waiting for a service professional to confirm their request. I understood immediately what had happened. The navy dress, the hair pulled back, standing near the catering table. To someone who had arrived expecting staff and guests, the math had been done without a second thought. I could have corrected her. I should have corrected her. Instead, I heard Diane's voice carry across the room, bright carrying perfectly projected for maximum reach. "That's Cass. She's been helping us get everything organized today. She knows where everything is." I went still. There it was. Not an accident, not a misunderstanding she had failed to correct. A statement, delivered to a room full of people in a single sentence, casual as weather. "She's been helping us get everything organized." The woman with the pearls smiled at me more warmly now, the way people smile at service staff when they want to seem gracious. "Oh, wonderful. The crab things whenever you get a chance." I looked at her. I looked across the room at Diane, who had already turned back to her other guests, the sentence deployed and abandoned mission complete. My father was 20 feet away with his back to me, laughing at something a man in a blazer had said. I thought about 18 years. I thought about the rest stop off I-95 and the 4 minutes I sat counting. I thought about the invitation on my kitchen counter. It would mean the world. And I thought about how much I wanted to just see my father without turning the evening into a battlefield. So I went to the kitchen. I am not ashamed of that. I want to be clear about that. I went to the kitchen because I was choosing my father over my pride, and that is not a small thing, and I knew it even then. There is a kind of dignity in choosing not to fight every fight, especially when the person you came to see is standing 20 feet away, looking healthier than you feared and smaller than you remembered, and all you want is a few more minutes with him before the evening ends. I found the crab cakes on a tray near the oven. I carried them out. I delivered them to the woman with the pearls, who thanked me with the particular warmth people reserve for good service. I smiled back. I set the tray down. And then a man I didn't recognize appeared at my elbow, late 60s, soft-spoken, a half-eaten canapé in one hand. "Any chance there's more of the white wine? The good one, not the other one." He said it gently, apologetically, like he knew he was asking a favor. I looked at him. He looked back. "Sure," I said. I went to find the wine. Brandon, my half-brother, 28. Diane's son, wearing a sport coat that still had the tags on it, emotionally, if not literally, caught my eye from across the room. He looked at me. He looked at the wine bottle in my hand. He looked away. I had not expected him to say anything. He didn't surprise me. I poured the wine. The string lights outside were beautiful in the early evening dark. Through the tall windows, I could see my father moving among his guests, shaking hands, laughing alive, which was the point, which was what mattered, and I held that thought like something I was keeping warm in both hands. 3 more hours, I told myself. Just 3 more hours. The next 90 minutes were a kind of slow education in what people will ask of you when they have decided what you are. I want to describe it carefully because I think it matters. Not the humiliation of it. I have been in situations that make a dinner party in Virginia look like a spa weekend, but the particular texture of it, the way it accumulates. Each individual moment is nothing. A tray carried, a glass refilled, a question answered with a smile. But the accumulation is something else. It is the weight of being seen as less over and over by people who are not even trying to be cruel. That is almost the worst part. They were not trying. They were just reading the room the way Diane had set it for them, and acting accordingly, and not once stopping to ask whether the room had been set correctly. The woman with the pearls, her name was Patricia, I learned because she introduced herself to every other guest, and not to me, asked me twice more for things. Once for extra napkins. Once to find out if there was more of the mushroom tartlet. I found both. I said nothing. A man named Gerald, who was apparently a former business partner of my father's, handed me his empty glass without looking at me and said, "Scotch. 2 fingers neat," in the tone of someone placing an order at a counter. I took the glass. I found the scotch. I brought it back. He thanked me without making eye contact. A woman I did not know and will not name asked me where the powder room was, and when I told her, added pleasantly with genuine helpfulness in her voice, "You might want to check on the hand towels in there. I think they're running low." She was not being unkind. She genuinely thought she was helping me do my job well. I checked on the hand towels. They were fine. I stood in the powder room for 30 seconds with my back against the door and my eyes on the ceiling. The ceiling was the same pale yellow I remembered from childhood. My mother had chosen that color. Diane had repainted every other room in the house within 2 years of moving in, but somehow this one had survived. I used to think that was an oversight. Standing there at 42, I wondered for the first time if my father had asked her not to. Small mercies. You learn to collect them. I came back out. Brandon found me near the drink table at some point in the 2nd hour. He had the look of a man who wanted to say something and had not yet decided if the cost was worth it. He poured himself a drink. He stood next to me for a moment without speaking. "You don't have to do this," he said finally, quietly. I looked at him. "I know," I said. "She just—" He stopped, started again. "She told people before you arrived that you were helping set up." "I know," I said again. He nodded at his drink. He had the decency to look uncomfortable, which I gave him some credit for. Brandon was not a bad person. He was a person who had grown up inside Diane's version of the world and had never had a strong enough reason to question it. I did not blame him for that. I had once lived inside that version too, and it had taken the United States Navy to give me the exit. "You should say something," he said. "Maybe." I said. To Dad, at least. I looked across the room at my father, who was sitting now in one of the garden chairs outside, a guest leaning toward him in conversation, my father's hand resting on his knee. In that particular way he had of listening fully, completely, like the person speaking was the only person in the world. He had always been good at that. It was the thing I had loved most about him, and also the thing that had hurt most, watching him give that quality of attention to Diane, to her friends, to her version of events year after year. "He came to get me," I said, "when I was 12 and I fell out of the oak tree in the backyard and I broke my wrist. He was at a meeting 40 minutes away. He left the meeting and drove 40 minutes and carried me to the car himself, even though I was already too old to be carried. He didn't say anything on the way to the hospital. He just drove with one hand and held my good hand with the other." Brandon was quiet. "I'm here for that person," I said. "Not for this." I gestured slightly at the room. At the apron I had set down an hour ago and somehow picked back up again when someone needed something. At the particular invisible geometry of the evening. Brandon looked at his drink for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "I'm sorry, Cass." I believed him. I believed he meant it in this moment. Whether it would survive contact with Diane's version of events later, I wasn't sure. But I took it for what it was. "Go talk to your mother's guests," I said. "I'm fine." He went. I was not entirely fine. But I was managing, which is a different thing, and often a more useful one. The evening had reached that hour somewhere between 8 and 9 when parties crest and begin their slow descent toward coats and goodbyes. The catering staff were moving more efficiently now, consolidating trays, refreshing the dessert table. I had at some point become genuinely indistinguishable from them in the logic of the room, and I had made a kind of peace with that. 3 hours, I had told myself. I was close. Diane swept past me at one point without stopping. She said in a low conversational tone, the way you might remind someone of a task, "The dessert plates need to go out, Cass." Then she was gone, already smiling at the next cluster of guests. I stood holding an empty tray. There is a specific kind of anger that does not feel like anger in the moment. It feels like clarity. Everything sharpens. Your hands are very steady. You are aware of every detail in the room, the way the light catches a glass, the distance between yourself and the nearest exit, the exact words that were just said, and the precise weight of their intent. I had felt this clarity in courtrooms. I had felt it in rooms with no windows and difficult documents. I had felt it in the field once in a situation I am not going to describe here. I had not expected to feel it in my father's backyard in Virginia over a plate of dessert. I set the tray down. I did not go get the dessert plates. I walked to the edge of the garden instead, where the string lights ended and the dark of the lawn began, and I stood there breathing the night air which smelled like cut grass and someone's nearby fire pit, and I gave myself 60 seconds. I was on 53 when I heard the front door open. I heard footsteps on the porch. And then I heard Diane's voice from inside the house, bright and carrying as ever, saying to someone, "Oh, come in, come in. Jim, is it Robert? Will be so pleased." I didn't turn around yet. I heard the footsteps cross the threshold. I heard the room shift the way a room shifts when someone enters it, who changes its gravity even in ordinary clothes, even when no one yet knows why. 57. 58. 59. I turned around. He was standing just inside the doorway, flannel shirt open at the collar, khaki trousers, no insignia, no uniform, nothing that would tell a room full of civilians anything at all about who they were looking at. He was 71 years old, and his hair had gone fully white, and he was about 20 pounds lighter than the last time I had seen him, which had been across a conference table in a building in Washington that does not appear on any public map. Rear Admiral James Harlow, retired. Formerly the senior legal authority over every JAG operation in the Atlantic Fleet. The man who had signed off on my commission, my first deployment, my commendation after the Reston case, and 4 years ago my separation papers with an expression on his face I had never been able to fully read. He was holding a bottle of wine and looking around the room with the mild, patient expression of a man who has stood in far more uncomfortable places and waited far longer than this. Then his eyes found me. I watched it happen. The scan of the room practiced automatic, the kind of visual sweep you never fully stop doing once it is trained into you, and then the pause. The small, almost imperceptible stillness that meant recognition. I did not move. He looked at me for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked at the tray near my hand, then back at my face, and something moved behind his eyes that I could not entirely name. Not quite surprise, not quite sorrow, something in the complicated territory between them. He crossed the room. Not fast, not with any urgency that would draw attention. He moved the way he had always moved, with the deliberate, unhurried authority of someone who has never needed to rush to be taken seriously. He stopped in front of me. Up close, he looked tired in the way that honorable men look tired when they have seen enough of the world to know exactly how it works. There were new lines around his eyes. His handshake when he extended his hand, because of course he extended his hand, was still iron. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, quietly, for me only. "Admiral," I said, just as quietly. He looked at me for a moment. Then he looked at the tray again, deliberately making sure I saw him look. "Whose party is this?" he said. "My father's," I said. Something shifted in his jaw. A small movement. Controlled. "And whose idea was the apron?" I didn't answer that. He nodded once slowly, the way he had always nodded when he was filing information away for later use. "Jim." Diane materialized at his elbow with the smoothness of long social practice. A hand extended a smile that could have lit a small room. "I'm Diane Alexander, Robert's wife. So glad you could come. George Henderson mentioned you'd retired to the area." "Diane." He shook her hand with the same measured courtesy he gave everyone. "Beautiful home." "Oh, thank you. Cass has been such a help getting everything together tonight." Diane touched my arm briefly proprietorially, the way you indicate a useful object. "She's very capable." The smile she gave me then was impeccable. Not a crack in it anywhere. Harlow looked at Diane. Then he looked at me. Then he looked back at Diane, and something in his expression went very, very quiet. "Yes," he said. "She is." Diane's smile held. She excused herself toward another cluster of guests. Harlow watched her go. Then he turned back to me and he said it. Not loudly. He didn't need to. But the room had reached one of those natural lulls that happen at parties, a momentary collective breath between conversations, and his voice carried the way voices carry when they have spent decades commanding the attention of rooms far larger than this one. "Ghost." One word. The woman to my left, Patricia Pearl's mushroom tartlet, stopped mid-sentence. Gerald 2 feet away turned from his scotch. Brandon across the room went very still. My father, just stepping back inside from the garden, looked up, and Diane, 15 feet away with her back half turned, went motionless in a way that was different from everyone else's stillness. Theirs was confusion. Hers was something she was trying very hard to suppress. The man next to Harlow George Henderson, who had invited him tonight, who was apparently a retired Army colonel himself, which I had not known, looked at Harlow with an expression that shifted from social to something much more attentive in the space of about a second.
"Jim,"
Henderson said carefully.
"You know her."
Harlow did not look away from me when he answered.
"Lieutenant Commander Cassandra Alexander," he said. "JAG Corps. 18 years active. Commended twice. Prosecuted the Whitfield procurement fraud, 14 counts, 12 convictions, saved the Navy approximately $40 million, and saved 14 enlisted personnel from having their careers ended for a crime they didn't commit." He paused. "She was one of the finest legal officers I had in 23 years of command."
The room was very quiet. Patricia was looking at me the way people look when they are rapidly rebuilding a picture they thought was finished. Gerald had put down his scotch. My father was standing just inside the door to the garden with an expression I had never seen on his face before, not in 42 years. It was the expression of a man hearing something he had always suspected and had never found the courage to ask about directly. And Harlow, still not looking away from me, did something I had seen him do exactly once before in a room in Washington, when a very junior officer had done something that warranted acknowledgement in a context where rank could not be announced. His right hand moved to his temple. Not a full salute, a small one. Private. Deliberate. Just enough. I felt something crack open in my chest that I did not have a name for at 42. I think I had been keeping it closed for a very long time. I straightened. Slightly. Automatically. The way you straighten when you have been trained to, when the moment calls for it, when something in the room has shifted irrevocably and your body knows before your mind has finished processing. Diane turned around. She was smiling still. She was very good at the smile, but her eyes had done something they could not undo. They had gone to Harlow, then to me, then to my father, and in that triangle of looks I watched her calculate something quickly and come up with an answer she did not like. "Well," she said, bright as a blade, "it sounds like Cass has had quite the career. We're all very proud." The silence that followed that sentence was the loudest thing in the room. Henderson looked at her. Harlow looked at her. My father looked at her. And I, for the first time since I had walked through that front door, did not look away from her either. "Yes," I said, quietly, evenly, the way I had learned to speak in courtrooms, in difficult rooms, in rooms designed to make you small. "It's been an interesting career." I set the tray down on the table beside me. I did not pick it up again. George Henderson asked me quietly while Diane was redirecting the room's attention toward the dessert table with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has managed social weather for 30 years. He asked me which case I was proudest of. It was a kind question, the kind that gives you something to hold on to. I thought about it for a moment. There were cases I could not name. There were cases that lived in sealed files in buildings I was no longer cleared to enter. There were cases that had cost me sleep for years, and cases I had won and still woke up thinking about, wondering if I had gotten everything right, if the outcome had been genuinely just or just technically correct, which are not always the same thing. But there was one case I could talk about. One that was public record now mostly. One that I had thought about on the drive down I-95, sitting at that rest stop with the engine running, which tells you something about how deep it lived in me. The Whitfield case. Harlow had mentioned it. 14 counts, 12 convictions, $40 million. Those are the numbers that appear in the record. They are accurate, and they are also almost completely insufficient to describe what that case actually was. Let me tell you what it actually was. In the fall of 2017, 14 enlisted sailors ranging in rank from seaman apprentice to petty officer second class were brought up on charges of theft and falsification of procurement records aboard the USS Decatur, a guided missile destroyer out of Norfolk. The charges were serious. The documentation appeared solid. 3 of the 14 had already accepted plea agreements by the time the case reached my desk. I was 38 years old. I had been in JAG for 9 years. I had handled procurement fraud before it is depressingly a recurring category, and I knew what the evidence patterns usually looked like. These patterns looked wrong. I cannot explain fully what I mean by that without getting into details that are either classified or deeply technical, but the short version is this. The documentation was too clean. Procurement fraud at the enlisted level is almost always messy, partial records, inconsistent timestamps, the fingerprints of people working quickly and nervously and without full understanding of the systems they are manipulating. What I was looking at had none of that texture. It was smooth in the way that things are smooth when someone with significant system access and significant motivation has constructed them to be. I told my supervising officer, a commander named Purcell, who is now retired and who was then under considerable institutional pressure to close the case quickly and cleanly, that I needed more time. He told me the timeline was set. I worked nights. I want to be clear about what that means. I do not mean I stayed late at the office. I mean I did not sleep for approximately 11 weeks in any meaningful sense of the word. I mean I drove to Norfolk on 4 separate occasions and sat with those 14 sailors in some cases over the objections of their assigned counsel who thought I was another layer of prosecution, and I listened to them. Really listened. The way you listen when you have set aside everything you think you already know and you are just trying to understand what actually happened. What actually happened was that a senior chief petty officer named Wallace Whitfield, 22 years of service commendations, the kind of record that makes institutional trust automatic, had been running a private diversion operation through the ship's supply chain for approximately 4 years. He was good at it. He was very good at it. And when the internal audit finally flagged the discrepancies, he had done something that I still think about when I need a reminder of what humans are capable of in extremis. He had spent 3 weeks systematically restructuring the digital trail to point at 14 people who had no idea what was happening. 14 people. He had chosen them carefully, young, relatively junior, from backgrounds that made institutional credibility harder to claim. In 2 cases, sailors who had had minor disciplinary issues in their first year of service. Nothing serious. Nothing that should have followed them, but enough to make the story feel plausible to someone who wanted it to. 3 of them had already taken plea deals. Already. I spent 11 weeks, and I found the seam in the documentation, a timestamp irregularity in the server logs that required understanding both the ship's supply management software and the specific firmware version running on the backup servers that quarter, which is a very narrow intersection of knowledge, and I happened to sit inside it. I pulled that thread. I pulled it for 3 months. Whitfield was arrested on a Tuesday morning in February 2018. He was prosecuted on 12 counts. He was convicted on all 12. The 3 sailors who had taken plea deals had their agreements vacated. All 14 had their records cleared. 11 of them are still serving. One of them made chief last year, I know, because Henderson, who apparently follows these things, mentioned it to me tonight while Harlow was talking to my father. I am telling you this not because I want credit. I am telling you this because I need you to understand what the work was, what it cost, what it meant. Those 14 sailors did not know my name when it started. They did not know who was working their case in the middle of the night in an office in Washington.
They did not know that someone had looked at the too clean documentation and felt the wrongness of it, and decided that wrongness was worth 11 weeks of her life. That is what the work was most of the time. Anonymous, exhausting, done in the dark by people whose names do not appear in the stories afterward. Henderson was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said, 12 convictions on a case like that is exceptional work, Commander. 11 weeks, Harlow said from just behind my shoulder. I hadn't realized he'd moved closer. She briefed me at the end of week 2. I told her the timeline was fixed. He paused. She nodded and went back to work. Did she say anything? Henderson asked. Harlow looked at me. There was something in his expression, not quite amusement, but the first cousin of it. She said, "Understood, sir. I'll be quick." Henderson laughed softly. A couple of nearby guests who had drifted into the orbit of the conversation laughed too uncertain of the full context, but reading the room correctly enough to know something significant was being described. My father had moved closer. He was standing at the edge of the small circle that had formed Henderson Harlow 3 or 4 guests, and he was listening with that quality of attention I had described to Brandon earlier. Fully, completely, like the person speaking was the only person in the world. He was looking at me like he was meeting someone for the first time. I understood that feeling. I had met myself for the first time in a similar way once in a room in Washington late at night, looking at a server log timestamp and realizing I was right that the wrongness I had felt was real and provable and worth every one of those 11 weeks. The knowing of your own worth is a quiet thing. It does not announce itself. It just settles slowly like sediment in still water until one day you realize it has been there all along. I looked at my father. He looked back at me, and neither of us said anything, which was its own kind of conversation, one we had been waiting 42 years to have. The circle around us had grown without anyone quite deciding to grow it. That is how these things happen at parties. Someone raises their voice slightly, not with intent, just with the natural expansion of a story that has weight, and the people nearby recalibrate without thinking, angling their shoulders inward, letting their other conversations trail off. By the time I noticed, there were perhaps 12 people listening, maybe 14. Some of them I recognized, some I didn't. All of them had the particular stillness of people who have understood that something real is happening in a room that had until recently been only a party. Diane was not in the circle. I could see her at the periphery near the dessert table speaking to a woman in a yellow dress with an animation that looked effortful. Her back was mostly to us, but I had spent enough years reading rooms to know that her attention was entirely here. My father was still standing at the edge of the circle. He had not moved in several minutes. It was Henderson who asked the question that changed the temperature of the evening. He asked it gently in the tone of a man who has learned that the most important questions are the ones that sound like small talk until they land. "Commander," he said, "Harlow mentioned you separated 4 years ago. After 18 years, that's an unusual point to leave. What happened?" The room got quieter. I looked at Henderson. I looked at Harlow, who was watching me with an expression I could not entirely read, careful, attentive waiting. I had not planned to say this tonight. I want to be clear about that. I had come to this party with one objective: see my father. Get through the evening. Go home. The rest of it, the apron, the dessert plates, the accumulated small humiliations, none of that had been part of any plan I'd made. And this certainly had not been. But there is a moment in certain situations, I had felt it in courtrooms, I had felt it in the field, when the architecture of events has shifted enough that the truth becomes not just possible but necessary. When continuing to withhold it would be its own kind of lie. I was in that moment,
4 years ago, I said I was working a case. A procurement fraud investigation, not Whitfield, a different one. Larger, more complex. It involved a defense contractor with significant political connections, and the investigation had reached a point where certain people with certain relationships to certain elected officials had become uncomfortable. I kept my voice even, courtroom even. The kind of even that is not calm exactly, but is control, which is a different thing. I received a communication, not through official channels, through a personal intermediary. The substance of the communication was that the investigation was creating problems for people who were in a position to create problems for me, and that a mutually agreeable resolution might involve the investigation concluding without the findings I had documented. Henderson's expression had gone very still. In other words, he said quietly, you were asked to bury it. The language was more elegant than that, I said. But yes. And you didn't. I did not. And then, I paused for exactly 1 second. And then the investigation was reassigned. I was offered a transition to reserve status with full benefits and a letter of commendation that I was told would reflect excellently on my record. The letter was accurate as far as it went. It simply didn't mention why the timing was what it was. I could feel the quality of the listening in the room change. The people who had drifted in from other conversations, who had come expecting a pleasant story about a woman in uniform, they were understanding now that this was something else. Something with edges. Harlow spoke. Quietly, but with the precision of a man choosing each word with full awareness of its weight. I signed those papers, he said. I want to be clear about that. I signed them, and I have thought about that decision every month for 4 years. He paused. The pressure that was applied came from a level above my authority to resist without consequences that would have ended more careers than just Commander Alexander's. That is not an excuse. It is a fact. I have carried both of those things separately and together for a long time. The room was very quiet. My father made a sound. Not a word. Just a small, involuntary sound, the kind that escapes when something hits a place you did not know was unprotected. I did not look at him yet, because I had not said the part that I needed to say. The part I had not planned to say tonight, standing in my father's backyard under the string lights that smelled like summer and my own childhood with 14 guests listening and Diane at the periphery with her back to me. The intermediary, I said, was not a professional contact. It was not someone from the defense contractor's legal team. It was not a lobbyist or a political operative. I stopped for one breath. It was a personal acquaintance of someone in my family, someone who had a long-standing private relationship with the elected official whose interests were at stake, someone who made a phone call on that official's behalf because she had the access and the motivation and the belief that I would not be able to prove it. The silence that followed was complete. Henderson looked at me. Harlow looked at me. And then slowly, inevitably, like a physical law being observed in real time, every person in that circle turned to look at the woman in the cream linen pantsuit standing at the periphery of the room with her back to us. Diane did not turn around immediately. When she did, her face was composed. She had always been extraordinary at composing her face. 30 years of practice. 30 years of managing rooms and redirecting conversations and ensuring that the version of events most favorable to Diane was the version that survived the evening. But her eyes had done it again, that small, involuntary recalculation, that fraction of a second where the performance slipped and something true showed through before she could cover it. My father saw it. I watched him see it. And I watched something happen to his face that I do not have adequate words for. It was not anger, though anger was in it. It was not grief, though grief was in it too.
It was the expression of a man who has been holding two versions of a story in his hands for a very long time, one that was comfortable and one that was true, and has just understood with the cold clarity of a room full of witnesses that he no longer has the option of choosing the comfortable one. He looked at Diane. She looked back at him. And in that look, in that 3 seconds between them that contained 30 years, I saw the exact moment my father understood what kind of woman he had been protecting, and from whom and for how long. I had not come here for this, but I was not going to stop it. Diane moved first. That was always her instinct movement redirection, the tactical repositioning of a woman who had spent 30 years ensuring that the conversation was never the one that was actually happening. She crossed the room with a smile already assembled, a hand slightly extended, the body language of someone about to offer a clarification that will make everything make sense. "Cass," she said, warmly, with the particular warmth she deployed for witnesses. "I think there may be some confusion here. If you're implying—" "I'm not implying anything," I said. My voice was very quiet. It was the quietest it had been all evening. I have learned over many years that the quieter you speak in a room that is already silent, the more completely you are heard. "I'm describing," I said. "There's a difference." She stopped 2 feet from me. The smile was still present, but it had gone effortful at the edges the way smiles do when they are no longer receiving any structural support from the feeling underneath. "Cass," my father's voice, from behind me to my left. He had moved without me noticing. He was closer now. "Let her answer." Diane looked at him. Something moved across her face. Surprise, I think, or the nearest thing to it she ever allowed herself. In 30 years he had not said those words. In 30 years he had been the buffer, the peacemaker, the man who smoothed things over before they became the thing they actually were. She had built a great deal on that pattern. She had built, in fact, almost everything on it. He said it again, quietly. "Let her answer." Diane's chin lifted by a fraction of an inch. A small movement, barely visible. But I had watched her face for 30 years, and I knew what it meant. It meant she had made a decision and was no longer performing for the room. She was managing the situation now, which was a different mode and a more dangerous one. "Robert," she said, "I don't know what Cassandra has told these people, but I would think very carefully before—" "I have a document," I said. The room went still in a new way. Diane stopped speaking. I reached into my bag, the plain leather bag I had carried in from the car, the bag that had sat under the drink table for most of the evening, while I carried trays and refilled glasses and told myself 3 more hours, and I took out a manila envelope. Thin, worn slightly at the corners from being moved in and out of files over 4 years, not thick enough to be dramatic, just thick enough to be real. I did not open it. I did not need to. When the investigation was reassigned, I said, I had already documented the communication chain, not because I anticipated this specific evening, because documentation is what I do and what I have always done, and because in 18 years of JAG work, I learned that the truth has a very short shelf life if you do not take care of it properly. I looked at Diane. The envelope contains a record of 3 phone calls placed from a number registered to a prepaid device purchased at a drugstore in Alexandria in September of 2021. The calls were made to the personal cell phone of a sitting U.S. senator whose committee had oversight of the defense contractor at the center of my investigation. The device was purchased with cash, which was careful. The calls were made from a location with a security camera, which was not. Diane said nothing. I also have a copy of a text message exchange between that senator and a member of his staff discussing the
I paused, finding the exact language from memory, the situation with the Navy lawyer that Diane flagged, and what the timeline for resolution needed to be. The senator's name was not in that text as Diane. It was in that text as D. But there were only so many people with both the access and the motive, and the phone records placed one of them at a specific intersection in Alexandria on a specific afternoon, and I had had 4 years to make that case airtight in the way that only a person who has nothing left to lose and nowhere else to be makes cases airtight. Henderson exhaled slowly through his nose. Harlow said nothing. He had known some of this. Not all of it. Brandon, who had been standing near the back of the circle for the last 10 minutes, said very quietly in a voice that sounded younger than 28. Mom. Not a question. Not an accusation. Just the word. Just her name in his mouth, with the weight of everything he was only now understanding pressing against it. Diane looked at him, and for one unguarded moment, one fraction of a second before the performance reassembled itself, I saw something on her face I had never seen before in 30 years of watching her. I am not going to call it guilt, because I am not sure guilt was within her emotional vocabulary, but it was something adjacent to it, something that knew. "This is absurd," she said. Her voice was still controlled, still smooth, but it was working harder than it had been 5 minutes ago. Cassandra has clearly built a narrative around what was a routine administrative Diane. My father's voice. She stopped. He was standing beside me now. I had not registered him moving. He was standing beside me the way he had stood beside me in the car on the way to the hospital when I was 12. Not saying anything, just present, just there, and he was looking at his wife of 28 years with the expression of a man who has finally chosen. "Stop," he said. One word. The quietest thing he had said all evening. She looked at him. He looked back. And in that look I understood something I had not let myself believe in 42 years of being that man's daughter. He had always known on some level what she was. He had chosen comfort over clarity for a very long time. That is a human failure, not a monstrous one. People do it every day. They do it because clarity is expensive and comfort is right there, and the cost of choosing comfort does not always arrive as a single bill. It arrives in installments, small and manageable, until one day it arrives all at once. Tonight it had arrived all at once. Diane looked around the room, at Henderson, at Harlow, at the 14 or so guests who had been standing in that circle for the past 20 minutes and were now looking at her with the particular expression of people who have watched something they cannot unsee. She looked at Brandon, whose face had gone very young and very still. She looked at my father, who did not look away. And then she looked at me. I did not give her anything. Not contempt. Not satisfaction. Not the cold comfort of my anger, which she did not deserve, and which I had decided somewhere in those 60 seconds at the edge of the garden was no longer worth the energy it cost to maintain. I just looked at her. She turned and walked toward the house. The string lights swayed slightly in a breeze that had come up from the south. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Henderson quietly said, "Is there more of that scotch?" And somewhere in the circle someone laughed, soft, almost involuntary, and the room breathed again. The party did not end immediately. That surprised me in the moment. I had expected the room to fracture, guests making polite excuses, reaching for coats, finding sudden reasons to be elsewhere. That is what I would have expected from a room full of people who had just witnessed something they had not come to witness, something that had arrived uninvited into what was supposed to be a pleasant evening of good food and easy conversation. But it did not fracture. It contracted.
The way a fire contracts when you add a log pulling inward, burning hotter, smaller, and more concentrated. The people at the edges of the circle drifted away, yes, but the people at the center stayed. And the people who stayed were not staying out of politeness or morbid curiosity. They were staying because they had something to say. The first was a man named Walter Cobb. I did not know Walter Cobb. He was a guest of the Hendersons, a retired Army warrant officer, 67 years old. A quiet man who had spent most of the evening near the garden wall with a glass of beer and an expression of watchful patience that I recognized as the particular stillness of people who have learned to assess situations before entering them. He had not been part of the circle during the confrontation. He had watched from a slight distance. He approached me directly. No preamble. "My nephew," he said, "was one of the 14. I looked at him. "Petty Officer 2nd Class Marcus Cobb," he said. "USS Decatur, 2017. I knew the name. Of course I knew the name. I knew all 14 names. I had read their service records so many times in those 11 weeks that I could have recited them in my sleep and had in fact done something close to that on more than one occasion, lying awake at 3 a.m, going through the details one more time, looking for the thing I might have missed. Marcus Cobb had been 23 years old when the charges were filed. He had been 2 years into his service, and by every measure of his record was exactly the kind of sailor the Navy needed, and the kind of young man who deserved better than what Wallace Whitfield had tried to do to him. "He's still in," I said. "Made Petty Officer 1st Class last year." Walter Cobb looked at me for a long moment. His jaw worked slightly. He was not a man who cried, I could see that clearly, but he was a man who was very close to the edge of something and was managing it with the careful dignity of someone who has managed difficult things before. "He doesn't know your name," he said. "None of them do, I think. Marcus always said the lawyer who cleared them was never identified to them directly." "That's standard," I said. "The work doesn't require the acknowledgement." "No," he said. "But I'd like you to know that his mother lit a candle every Sunday for 2 years for whoever had worked that case. She didn't know your name either. She lit the candle anyway." I did not trust my voice for a moment. "Tell Marcus congratulations on the promotion," I said when I had it back. Walter Cobb nodded once. Then he extended his hand and I shook it, and he held it for a moment longer than a handshake requires, and then he stepped back. He was not the only one. A woman named Grace Okafor, 58, a retired Navy nurse who had known my father through his church and had been one of Diane's garden committee since before I left for the service, found me near the drink table 20 minutes later. She had the expression of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has just been given permission to set it down. "I want you to know," she said without introduction, "that I have watched that woman run this household for 25 years, and I have watched what she did with your name in this room whenever anyone brought it up." She paused. "I am sorry I never said anything." I looked at her. "You didn't know what you were seeing." "I suspected," she said. "That's not quite the same as not knowing. It wasn't." But I was not going to spend the energy prosecuting Grace Okafor's conscience tonight. She had enough of that already. I could see it in her face. "Thank you for saying something now," I said. She nodded. She looked like she wanted to say more, and then thought better of it and then said it anyway. "Your father is a good man. He loved her. People do foolish things when they love someone who doesn't deserve it." "I know," I said. I did know. I had spent 18 years not quite forgiving him for it, and somewhere in the last 2 hours had arrived without planning to at something that was not forgiveness exactly, but was the beginning of the terrain where forgiveness lives.
That would take longer. That was work for a different night in a quieter place with just the two of us and no audience and no envelope on the table between us. But the terrain was visible now. That was something. Harlow found me last. The party had thinned considerably by then. The catering staff were consolidating quietly in the kitchen. My father was sitting in one of the garden chairs with Brandon beside him, the two of them not speaking, just sitting, which seemed to be what they both needed. The string lights were still on. The night had cooled. Harlow stood beside me, and we looked at the garden for a moment without speaking. He had his hands in his pockets. He looked in that moment like a tired old man at a party he had not expected to be the most consequential party of his recent retirement.
"I owe you an apology," he said. "You said that inside." "I said it to the room," he said. "I'm saying it to you."
I let that sit for a moment. "You signed the papers that let me go," I said. "You also signed the papers that sent me to Norfolk for the Whitfield case. You also signed my commendation after Reston. You also, as I recall, told a very junior lieutenant commander in her first year that she had better instincts than half the commanders on his staff, and that she should trust them." I paused. "I have tried to maintain a full accounting." He was quiet for a moment.
"You always were thorough,"
he said. "You trained me," I said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then he looked at me sideways with the expression I had seen in 100 difficult meetings assessing careful landings somewhere honest. "Ghost," he said quietly. Just the call sign. Just the name that had followed me for 18 years, through rooms with no windows, and cases that would never be declassified, and one very long evening in Virginia under string lights. "Still here," I said. He nodded. "Still here," he said, and that was enough. That was, in fact, exactly enough. Diane left that night, not dramatically, not with a slam door or a final pronouncement that would have required an audience still paying attention, and by 11 o'clock the audience had gone home. She packed a bag while my father sat in the garden with Brandon and me, and she called a car, and she left the way people leave when they have run out of moves, and know it quietly, efficiently, with the particular dignity of someone who has decided that the only remaining form of control available to her is the manner of her exit. I watched the headlights of the car move down Sycamore Hill Road from the garden chair where I was sitting. My father watched them too. Neither of us said anything for a long time. Brandon had gone inside to make coffee, a task he had assigned himself with the transparent relief of someone who needed to do something with his hands, and it was just the two of us in the garden, my father and me under the string lights that were still on because nobody had turned them off in the cooling Virginia night that smelled like cut grass and the end of something long.
"How long did you know?"
my father asked finally. I considered the question carefully. Not how long had I suspected. Not how long had I been gathering the evidence. He had asked how long I had known, and the answer to that was different. "About the phone calls specifically 4 years, I said. "About what she was in the general sense since I was 14. He absorbed that. "I'm sorry, Cass." The words were simple. He said them the way he said my name at the door, without decoration, without the scaffolding of explanation or justification that people often build around apologies to make them more comfortable for the person giving them. Just the words. Just their weight. I had waited a long time for those words. I want to be honest about that. I had waited for them at 18 when I left, and at 23 when I got my commission and called home and heard Diane's voice on the phone before his. I had waited for them at 29 when I made JAG and sent a card to the house and received a response in Diane's handwriting that said they were proud of me, which was not the same as him saying it in his own words.
I had waited for them at 38 when my career was dismantled by a phone call my father's wife made from a prepaid phone at a drugstore in Alexandria. The waiting had cost something. I am not going to pretend it hadn't. But I had also spent 18 years learning a particular truth about justice, which is that it almost never arrives looking the way you imagined it. It does not arrive clean. It does not arrive and immediately repair everything the damage undid. It arrives and it is real and it is true, and it is still not the same as what you lost, and you have to decide what to do with the gap between those things. I had been making that decision in small increments for the last 3 hours. "I know," I said. He looked at me. "That's not enough." "No," I said. "It's not. But it's what we have tonight, and tonight is what we have." He was quiet for a long time. "She told me," he said finally, "when you left the Navy, she told me it was your choice, that you'd decided you wanted something different, that the work had worn you out." He paused. "I believed her. I don't know if I believed her because it was true, or because I needed it to be." I thought about that. About the particular mercy we extend to ourselves when the truth is something we do not have the resources to absorb. About my father at 60 years old, recently recovered from a cardiac event, living in the house his wife had built around him for 30 years, and what it would have cost him to see clearly then. I did not excuse it, but I understood it. "Dad," I said, "I need you to hear something." He looked at me. "I did not come here tonight to burn this down," I said. "I came here to see you, because you had a heart attack and you are 64 years old, and you called me yourself, and I realized I had been waiting for conditions that were never going to be perfect, and you are my father, and I did not want to wait anymore." I stopped. Everything else that happened tonight, I didn't plan that. I didn't come armed for battle. I carry that envelope because I always carry it. It is a habit from 18 years of work, not a weapon I brought to your party." He nodded slowly. "But it is the truth," I said. "And now that it's out, I am not going to unsay it." "I wouldn't ask you to," he said. And then he did something he had not done since I was 12 years old, with a broken wrist in a hospital waiting room. He reached over and took my hand. Not both hands this time, just one, his right hand over my left, the way you hold on to something you are afraid of losing now that you understand what losing it would mean. We sat like that for a while. Brandon came back with coffee and looked at our hands and looked away quickly, and I could see him processing something, recalculating the geometry of his own family, of what he had grown up inside of what was true and what had been constructed. That was going to take him time. I was not going to rush it. He was 28 years old, and he had just watched his mother leave in a car in the dark, and whatever he was feeling about that was legitimate, and his, and not mine to manage. He handed me a mug. He sat down. The three of us drank coffee in the garden under the string lights. In the weeks that followed, things moved the way difficult things move, not quickly, not cleanly, but with the inexorable logic of processes that have been set in motion and cannot be recalled. Diane retained a lawyer. My father retained a different one. The separation was handled with the efficiency of two people who have run out of anything to say to each other and are communicating entirely through intermediaries. I gave a copy of the envelope's contents to a contact at the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. What happened after that is not my story to tell here. What I can tell you is that 2 months later, a certain senator announced he would not be seeking re-election, citing a desire to spend more time with his family, which is a sentence that has meant the same thing for as long as politicians have been saying it. I visited my father 3 more times before the year was out. Once to help him sort through things in the house when Diane's belongings were removed.
Once for Thanksgiving, just the three of us, my father and Brandon and me, in a kitchen that smelled like burnt edges on a boxed cake mix and 30 years of complicated love. Once, just because Atlas needed a long drive and my father had said very simply the last time I left, "Come back soon." I came back soon. A year later, I am sitting on my father's back porch. It is a Sunday morning in late June, and the oak tree at the edge of the yard, the one I fell out of when I was 9, the one that has been there longer than any of us, is in full leaf, and the light is coming through it the way light comes through old trees in pieces, in patches, not all at once. Atlas is asleep at my feet. My father is inside making eggs, and I can hear him moving around the kitchen with the careful, deliberate movements of a man who has been told by his cardiologist to take things slowly and has chosen to interpret that as taking things intentionally rather than less. Brandon called last week. He is in therapy. He said that plainly without embarrassment, which I thought was a good sign. He said he was trying to understand the difference between loyalty and complicity, and that it was harder than he expected, and I told him that it was supposed to be hard, and that the fact that he was doing it mattered. We talked for 40 minutes. It was the longest conversation we had ever had. Diane is living in Scottsdale. I know this because my father told me once, and neither of us has mentioned it since. I do not know if she is well. I do not wish her ill. I have thought carefully about what I actually feel toward her in the quiet of my house in Fredericksburg, with Atlas on the floor and the contract files stacked on the kitchen table, and what I have arrived at is something that does not have a clean name. It is not forgiveness in the sense people usually mean, the full release, the slate, wiped the wound, healed over smooth. It is more like the decision to stop carrying the weight of her in my daily life. To set it down, not because she deserves to be set free of it, but because I deserve to be free of it. Those are different reasons. Both of them are valid. The work she did to me was real. The years it cost me were real. The 11 weeks in Washington and the 34 years before that, and the night I sat at a rest stop off I-95 with the engine running, counting minutes, trying to decide if I was strong enough to go back, all of it was real and none of it disappears, because the truth finally came out in a garden in Virginia under string lights. But I am here, on this porch, in this morning. That is also real. Harlow and I have had lunch twice since the party. He is writing a book, A History of JAG Corps cases he considers foundational, which is a project he describes with the same careful understatement he applies to everything, but which I suspect is actually his way of making sure certain things are on the record before he can no longer put them there. He has asked me to contribute a chapter about the Whitfield case. I have said I will think about it. I am still thinking about it. Some things you hold for a long time before you decide whether they belong to you or to history. Walter Cobb sent me a letter, a physical letter handwritten on plain white paper. He said Marcus had been told finally the name of the lawyer who had worked his case. He said Marcus had asked him to pass along one sentence which Walter had written out in his careful warrant officer's handwriting at the bottom of the page. The sentence was, "Thank you for not stopping." I have kept the letter. I think about callsigns sometimes, about how they are given and what they mean and why they last. In the Navy, you do not choose your own callsign. It is given to you by the people you serve with, usually from something that happened, a moment, a mistake, a quality that emerged under pressure and got attached to your name and stayed there. The best ones are not flattering exactly. They are accurate. They are the thing your unit decided was most essentially true about you, distilled to something short enough to say in a moment when there is no time for anything longer. I got mine in the fall of 2009 during my second year of JAG work. I had been assigned to a case that had already been closed by a previous attorney and was being appealed. The prevailing consensus in the office was that the appeal had no merit and the original ruling was sound, and the appropriate move was to defend the record cleanly and move on. I read the file. I read it again. I found something in it, a procedural irregularity in the original evidence collection that was small enough to have been an oversight and significant enough to have affected the outcome, and I brought it to my supervisor. My supervisor told me the case was already closed. I told him it wasn't closed correctly. We had several versions of that conversation over the course of 3 weeks. At the end of the 3 weeks, I filed a motion that nobody expected me to file, and that required the case to be reopened. The outcome was different the second time. I came into the office the following Monday, and someone had written "ghost" on a piece of tape and stuck it to my chair. Nobody claimed responsibility. Nobody needed to. I asked an older attorney later why that name. I had expected something about moving quietly, about being hard to track, about the field work I had done in rooms with no windows. He looked at me like the answer was obvious. Because no matter how many times they tried to make you disappear, he said, you were still there, still on the file, still in the room, still on the record. I have thought about that for 13 years. I am still thinking about it. People over 60 know this truth. I think in a way that takes years to learn. The most durable form of power is not the kind that announces itself. It is not the loudest voice in the room, or the most impressive credentials on the wall, or the ability to make other people feel small so that you feel large. Those things are real, but they are also fragile. They depend on the cooperation of the people around you, on everyone continuing to agree that the arrangement makes sense. The durable kind of power is quieter. It is the kind that comes from knowing what you have done and why and what it cost, and deciding that it was worth it anyway. It is the kind that does not need a room's acknowledgement to remain true. It does not need the party to go well, or the apron to be removed, or the admiral to walk through the door at the right moment. Those things happened. I am glad they happened, but they did not make me who I am. I was already who I am. I had been for a long time in rooms with no windows and difficult documents, and 11 weeks of no sleep and a rest stop off I-95, where I sat for 4 minutes and then put the car in drive. That was always the story. Everything else was just the evening it finally had witnesses. My father calls from the kitchen. "Eggs are ready." Atlas lifts his head. I stand up. I walk inside. The oak tree is still catching the light in pieces behind me. Still here.